I'm going to show you how to use REST and Orchestrator. Let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. This is part 10 in a 10-part video series in which we're exploring how to make REST API calls. Here in part 10, we're going to be looking specifically at Orchestrator. Earlier in part 10b, we introduced you to the workflow called add a REST operation. And we found it was easy enough to add a single REST operation, but what if you need to add 5 REST operations, or 10 REST operations, or 50 or more? You need to run that workflow once per REST operation, and obviously the more REST operations provided by your REST server, the more work it's going to take to add them all. But back in that video, I told you that there's a way you can add them more efficiently. And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. So let's take a look at the workflow called add a REST host by Swagger spec as a string. You'll notice that there's another called from a URL. We'll take a look at that in the next video. The word Swagger here in this workflow name refers to, let me take you there, refers to Swagger.io and the technologies that they provide. Swagger provides a framework that developers can use to create REST APIs. Many of VMware's APIs use Swagger. Now what we're going to do is go take a look at their documentation. Specifically, we're going to go to docs/specification, and in here you'll see information about what was traditionally known as Swagger specs. Swagger specs enable developers to create a detailed description of all the operations in their API. And we can use those different ways. Again, we can get the Swagger spec as a plain old text file. We could copy it in as a string, or you can point to it using a URL. Again, that's what that other workflow is about. Now, on this page, there's lots of information and links to learn more about Swagger specs, but I want to take you straight to this article here called Basic Structure. Now, the basic structure here describes what these Swagger spec files look like. The version of Swagger spec that I first started working with was 2.0, but there's a newer version, 3.0, which actually has a different name. Now they call it Open API. So from here on out, if I say Swagger spec, I'm presumably talking about the 2.0 version, or if I say Open API, I'm talking about the 3.0 version. The workflow that we're looking at understands both. Now, if you want to learn more about the 2.0 version, you can click on this link here, but let's use the newer version, 3.0. As we can see here, we have a basic sample of what these Swagger spec or Open API spec look like. And as you can see, it looks like YAML. They can be written in JSON. This one happens to be written in YAML. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this into my clipboard. We'll paste this into the Orchestrator workflow here shortly. But before we do so, you might want to hit pause and take a few moments to study the code that you see here. You'll see obvious things such as there's a title and a description of what this spec file is about. Notice that there are some URLs that we can use. And additionally, notice that they're providing endpoint paths that correspond to the different operations defined by this REST API server. So we're going to go take a look now at Orchestrator. So back in Orchestrator, let's go ahead and run the workflow called add a REST host by Swagger spec as a string. We're going to run this. And the first thing that we're going to need to do is to give our connection to this REST server a name. So why don't we call this basic, since that's the basic structure example. Next, I'm going to paste in the Swagger spec, or the Open API 3.0 spec. So here is all that. Let me resize the window here so that you can see this is in fact the stuff that we were just looking at. There we go. Always do take notice of whether it says Open API 3.0.0 here or versus Swagger spec 2.0.0, because that's going to affect what you need to answer slightly different here in a moment. In fact, right down here. This specification is for 3.0.0, so Swagger 2.x is not appropriate. We're going to change this instead to API 3, OpenAPI 3.x, and as we do so, notice what happens to this tab here. So I'm going to choose OpenAPI 3.x, and no surprise here, it's changed the label of the tab. Now, we have a few more things to answer on the first tab. We need to provide, or actually optionally provide, what content type we're going to be passing in. So why don't we say application/JSON, since this server supports JSON, and we can specify what we want to receive back. Again, if you are using different REST servers, you need to check to see which data formats they support. But we're going to use JSON here. We talked about the timeouts in a previous video, and we talked about accepting the certificate and the redirection strategy. So essentially, all we're really doing here is giving a name, giving the spec, and saying what kind of spec. Now, let's go take a peek over at the OpenAPI 3.x tab. And as you can see here, it's very simple. All they want is a URL. Now, the spec file itself contains the URL, and we could conceivably just use what's in there, but you'll notice in this particular case that there are multiple URLs. So a REST server might be running in different locations, accessed via different URLs. So what we're doing here on the OpenAPI 3.x tab is simply specifying a URL to the server that we do want to use. Now we have some familiar looking tabs here. So authentication type gives us our usual choices. I'm going to choose none for this example. If we're using a web proxy, we would specify our settings here. And if we want to do something special with SSL, we would specify here. But I'm just going to leave these at their default settings. So again, the bulk of what we've just done took place here on this first tab. Let's go ahead and scroll down and click on Run. And when we click on Run, the workflow runs. The workflow is completed. And as you can see, our logs seem pretty happy. We could check the performance to see what's gone on, but what we really want to do here now is to go over to the inventory. The whole point of adding that REST operation was to, here's the inventory. The point of adding that, running that workflow to add the Swagger spec was to add a bunch of operations. Additionally, doing so also added our REST server. So let's go ahead and take a look at the HTTP REST inventory. And in here, you can see we've got our basic server. And in this specific case, we only picked up one REST operation. But the process that we went through is just as quick, whether you're doing one operation or 100 operations. In the next video, when I show you how to do the same sort of thing using a URL, we're going to add a bunch more operations, not just this piddly one. We'll add a multitude. Join me in the next video as we continue our exploration into REST and Orchestrator.